This is Gaming Through the Ages, and today we're looking at Landstalker, the Treasures of King Nole for the Sega Genesis / Mega Drive. You can also get the game digitally on Steam. Landstalker can be described as an action RPG played from an isometric perspective, but your character doesn't gain experience points. Instead, upgrades to health and armor are found or bought throughout the game, causing many gamers to compare the game to Zelda despite it feeling quite different. The first thing that jumps out when you boot up Landstalker is just how colorful the game is. While some graphics are a bit muddy, namely in the background, the overall graphical presentation and colorfulness is not commonly found on the Genesis and helps the game stand out from other titles on the system. The music is enjoyable and inviting at first, but it starts to wear on you after a while and feels repetitive. Landstalker places you in the shoes of Nigel, a young man who is after the treasures of King Nole, along with his pixie fairy sidekick thing, Friday. While the overall story is minuscule with a small cast and very little plot, the game makes up for it by being littered with witty writing and amusing characters. From bizarre character interactions to adult innuendos to oddball references, the game keeps you guessing what will happen next. The story essentially boils down to a race to find the treasures and has very little plot revealed until the very end, but it's worth playing through to see what happens. As mentioned, Landstalker can be likened to an action RPG or a Zelda game in that Nigel must wander from town to town and dungeon to dungeon. Towns typically have several characters to talk to in order to point you in the right direction, along with a variety of shops. This includes inns, item shops, and churches. In churches, you can remove status effects, which you will probably never need to do at a church, or save. In order to buy items or use the books at hotels or churches, you have to pick them up and toss them onto the counter. This is both strange and oddly satisfying. Outside of towns, you run into a small variety of enemies, which unfortunately stays small throughout the game. Combat, however, is a smaller gameplay element than you might think. More on that in a bit. The only thing you collect from enemies is gold, which is used to buy items in town or sometimes extra hearts. These extra hearts, called life stock, are important and are also found littered throughout the world. Although you can get plenty of these, I ended the game with nearly 90, you only start with 4. Being as it's easy to die, especially early on, it's important to buy a healing item called Eek Eek, which is automatically applied by Friday when your hit points reach 0. As I said, combat is fairly simple in Landstalker, consisting of nothing more than a simple sword swipe you will repeatedly carry out. Even the bosses are dispatched by mostly standing and hitting the sword button quickly. Not until late in the game is it necessary to even dodge most enemies. That certainly makes the game sound easy, but it's actually far from it. The gameplay elements that take center stage in Landstalker are platforming and puzzle solving. The difficulty of the platforming especially makes Landstalker simultaneously one of the most frustrating and most enjoyable experiences I've had on the Genesis. Unfortunately, the platforming can be difficult for the wrong reason. The isometric perspective makes Landstalker a damn impressive Genesis game, but also gives absolutely no sense of depth. Although it can be figured out with some trial and error, there are quite a few jumps which will test your concepts of perspective. You can completely miss a platform you believe you're jumping right onto. If only shadows were added to some of these areas, the overall experience could have been greatly improved. Occasionally, the perspective is used to hide things as well, but that aspect never manages to feel unfair or convoluted. The second big issue in Landstalker is the controls. In order to change your walking from horizontal to vertical or vice versa, you have to press 2 directional buttons at once so that you're pressing, say, upper left or lower right. If you don't hit them simultaneously or hit the little section in between them on the controller, which is an easy slip up, Nigel continues walking in the same direction he was in, and this can cause you to walk right off of small platforms. While the Genesis pad is a decent controller for this, it can still take some getting used to. Throughout Landstalker, you must traverse dungeons, which are often quite large and have some tricky puzzles. This was my favorite aspect of the game, as some of them are very satisfying, and all were manageable with some thought and practice. Some of the timed puzzles especially give you just barely enough time and feel almost impossible, but were all passable after a few tries. The best example of the game's puzzles is a dungeon filled with nothing but riddle rooms. Each room has a plaque with a riddle that must be solved in order to progress. These moments of creative game design keep the game feeling engaging and prevent it from becoming stale. Next to your livestock display, there is a refilling sword icon. Once Nigel upgrades his sword, a filled icon allows him to perform whatever that sword's special ability happens to be. Throughout the game, you can find upgrades for Nigel's equipment, such as better swords and armor, which offer different effects, and while most of these are found along the natural course of the game, some must be found through exploration, and there's a couple side quests to be uncovered as well. One of which opens up trees as waypoints for convenient quick traveling around the world, which can take some time to walk around, so it's worth doing. Overall, Landstalker is a fairly large game with tons to explore and see, and can be a ton of fun, but due to its ambition, it has some technical issues keeping it from truly shining. Still, despite its flaws, it's among the best experiences I've had on the Genesis, and I feel like I should have played it years ago. I definitely recommend checking this one out. Even if the controls and perspective take some getting used to, they're actually worth getting used to. It's rare that I would recommend completely looking past a game's flaws and trying it anyway, but Landstalker really feels like a diamond in the rough.